to think that both historically and in terms of substance, a limit on government tyranny is part of the Second Amendment, and an important part of the Second Amendment.
I said before, I'm not a Second Amendment scholar, but I do read the words of the Second Amendment. I think it has something to do as far as, and nobody else has convinced me otherwise, it has to do with the state militias and the right of the states to maintain their own militias, which means the right of the states to regulate the use of guns within the state. I just don't think it was meant to give to the federal government that power. I'm willing to accept it as a 14th Amendment privileges and immunity. I don't think it should be part of the Liberty Clause of the 14th Amendment. I think it's really a question of local police power. I don't think it was unlike Scalia, I do not believe the framers thought there should be a right of violent revolution against the federal government. I think that's a fantasy. Because I don't think the Constitution is a suicide pact. So I just don't agree with the Scalia approach to the issue. As I say, I'm happy to accept a limited right, as Justice Thomas suggested under the Privileges and Immunities Clause, to have a gun in the home, self-protection.
As a former Russian major, I would say, having been there, yeah, I absolutely agree with the premise of your question. I think that the tolerance in a given country for citizens' ability to own guns is a kind of a canary in the mine shaft for tyranny. Because one of the things, there's not a direct correlation, but you can absolutely be sure that one of the first things you need to do to have a really good tyranny is to make sure you disarm all of the citizens. Because if there ever comes a point where they get fed up, you want to make sure they can't fight back. And I think, yeah, so I would say canary in the mine shaft, yeah.
Isn't it true that Great Britain has very restricted gun laws?
But not as restrictive, say, as those countries.
What's that?
Now they do. Now they do.
You can't have guns. I mean, even the police don't carry guns in England.
Now they do.
So I'm not sure you're right. I mean, I don't know.
Well, I didn't say the perfect
you're
correlation.
right. I just think
Yeah.
the only really restrictive countries that have strict gun laws. I think lots of countries have very strict gun laws.
Well, let me turn it around and say that a country that doesn't have really strict gun laws is not certainly, but probably not a tyranny. It's hard to be a tyranny if your people are armed. Joe?
Mr. Neily, now you mentioned the importance of the right to bear arms for freed blacks after the Civil War and even their white allies.
Right.
But is there a relevant correlation today to the right to bear arms in people? Can we just take this importance right after the Civil War and say that that makes it necessary today? Or are there other reasons?
I don't think that, I don't interpret the 14th Amendment as exclusively a sort of a protection against race-based deprivations of liberty. I don't think the history supports that, and if that was ever, a plausible reading, we are so far beyond that in other areas of constitutional law, we don't read it that way. It is a protection against arbitrary or invidious deprivations of liberty, nonsensical deprivations of liberty, deprivations, regardless of your race, and basically whenever the government doesn't have a sufficient justification. And what I would say is, if you want to carry a gun down the street, and by the way, for those of you who don't know, you can do that in like 40 out of 50 states of this country. They have to give you a concealed carry permit if you don't have a mental health problem and you haven't got a criminal conviction and you're willing to take some class. So, not New Jersey, obviously, but not New York. But Vermont, like I said, you don't even need a license in Vermont. People are walking around armed all around you in states like Texas, Virginia, and Florida. And the parade of horribles that was predicted when all of this changed in the 80s has never materialized. That has just never happened. So I don't think the government could make a strong enough case to prevent you from walking around with a gun if you think that you want to or need to. The evidence is simply not there, and if they have to come up with some fairly strong justification, I don't think they can do it.
I also think we have probably one of the most highest murder rates in the world. Maybe there are a couple Latin American, South American countries that come close. Maybe Colombia, I don't know.
Russia, actually, is the highest.
What's that?
Russia is the highest murder rate of any industrialized.
Is that
country.
true?
No, true last time I
looked. Think the U.S.?
Oh, yeah.
That's news to me. But we have a pretty high murder rate in this country. And so how does that help? That I'm confused. Russia controls the guns, you said, right? They don't allow guns.
No, Russia has among the most restrictive gun laws in the world,
Yeah.
and they do nothing.
Mm-hmm. They kill each other with vodka or what?
Yeah, that would be
vodka.
Dina.
Yes. Hi. Well, question for Mrs. Neily. I have and obviously in today's age we all witness, this global terrorism threat and everything that's going on. And obviously the countries, every government, especially the U.S. government, has there's a huge movement towards strengthening the national security, and that in turn basically erodes the privacy and rights of the individual.
Yep.
So my question is basically, having in mind this obviously strong movement towards stronger national security laws, how realistic is basically that a government that allows people to carry weapons and open on the street, how realistic is that actually that's going to in any way prevent imposition of tyranny when actually the laws that we're imposing and the requests for stronger national security protections are going completely in other direction? So basically the relationship between the threat of terrorism and whatnot and the protection of individuals' rights.
Yeah, I don't see much correlation there, to be honest. I've never felt like the insurrectionist model of gun ownership was really all that strong. I mean, so you're in a militia, you'd like to overthrow the government, but darn it, there's that law that says you can't have a gun. So instead of just going out and getting one, you're like, we should go to federal court and see if they'll let us have some guns. It's not all that plausible. I think from the sort of insurrectionist standpoint, it was more symbolic. I don't put a whole lot of stock, by the way, just to come clean on the whole militia-centric interpretation of the Second Amendment. It's a really complex and interesting argument, not one we have time for, but let me throw out one little nugget. How many of you guys in the room are American citizens between the ages of 17 and 45? Raise your hands. How many of you know, no, men, sorry, men. No offense. Did you know that all of you are in the unorganized militia of the United States? And it has nothing to do with whether you're registered for selective service. Yeah. Under 10 U.S.C. Section 311, you have been in the unorganized militia of the United States since you were 17 years old. And that is just the tip of the informational iceberg that you would have to assimilate in order to really meaningfully engage this whole militia-centric argument. And I'll leave it at that, but just maybe be a little intrigued if you didn't know you were in the militia already.
Anyone else have any questions? Professor Askin, when you were speaking about Justice Stevens' dissent, you referred to a top-down model for the Second Amendment, and it struck me as and you were suggesting that we shouldn't. I think you were suggesting that we shouldn't have a top-down model, and I just wanted to challenge you a little bit on that, because if gun ownership is a right, typically speaking, we want kind of a top-down sort of assertion of our individual rights. Generally, I think that's pretty accepted. So like Chicago utterly banning handguns, that kind of doesn't seem like we have a right at all. To keep a gun. So I was wondering if you could kind of explain, maybe take on the role of Justice Stevens. Maybe.
Actually, I don't believe it's true that Chicago totally banned private ownership of guns. They allowed, I forget the details, but they did allow a lot of private gun ownership under licensing. But no, I said I'm perfectly happy to accept this notion of a private right to have a weapon, a gun in the home, a reasonable weapon, not a machine gun, in the home for private self-protection, and then leave it to the states and localities to decide how much further to allow, or what other restrictions to place on it. So I think that's, what Stevens is saying, it's not up to the federal, it should not be the federal government or the federal courts, really, to decide what the rules are for all the states and localities in the country. He says he thinks basically this should be left to local initiative. That was his position, and I would agree with it.
Again, I think there's just sort of this unexplained difference in approach between the right to keep and bear arms and every other right in the Constitution. So imagine Chicago had a law that said you can talk about politics in the home, right, but you can't do it out on the streets because it could just be too provocative. As a judge, I would say, well, okay, what evidence do you have?
Nobody got killed by free speech that I know of.
Oh, yeah, they have. Wow, okay, well, I've got some pictures of some pretty ugly mob violence. I mean, the rope was what did it, but the speech is what got them there. I mean, it happens. So, you know, I mean, okay, let's say the city of Chicago said, okay, you can express racist speech in the home, but not outside because it's too dangerous. Now we're talking about an actual court case, right? You know, something closer to that. Even then, a federal judge is going to say, okay, well, you know, what evidence do you have that allowing somebody to spout racist views on the street immediately leads to mob violence? And they actually make the government have some evidence. Whereas with the Second Amendment, we say, oh, well, you can have a gun in your home. Oh, great, okay, thanks. I think I'd like to take it out with me so I don't get raped or, you know, murdered by a skinhead mob, which almost happened to one of my clients in Heller. And he had a gun that he didn't need to shoot at anybody. He just pointed it at him, and he thinks that saved his life. I don't know, I wasn't there. So then they say, I want to take the gun out of the house. And the government says, well, you can't do that. Well, normally, if we're dealing with a real constitutional right, we then say to the government, okay, well, what evidence do you have that would be a problem? And the great thing is in this country, we've got reams and reams of evidence that it wouldn't be a problem. Because you can do it in like 39 out of 50 states. And there's no correlation whatsoever between the sort of the ease with which a state allows you to carry a concealed weapon outside of your home and any public policy outcome whatsoever, good, bad, or indifferent, that anyone's been able to prove. And when the government can't put up or shut up, then you get to exercise the right, whether it's speech or guns.
Any other questions?
Yeah, I just have the impact. I know recent news, drug violence in Mexico, Mexican authorities claim that the gun laws in the United States are feeding guns to Mexico. So just generally, just what is the impact of that sort of international concern over domestic gun?